is titled Climate Justice is a Class Issue, Time to Reframe the Climate Crisis. My name is Zack Polanski, I'm from the SWP Manchester branch, and I'll be chairing today's meeting. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who I'm so thankful that's come here, is Zack Polanski, the Deputy Leader of the Green Party, and is running to be the leader.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the lovely introduction. The climate crisis is not just a crisis of carbon. It's a crisis of power. It's a crisis of inequality. And like so many things that are running through our society and have done for decades through both Labour governments and Conservative governments, it's a crisis where a few people, the 1%, a tiny group of elites, are destroying our environment, but they're also destroying our democracy, and they're destroying our communities. And so during this opening remarks, I want to talk about working class power. I want to talk about the trade unions. But I also want to put a caveat in there. I also want to talk about what Guy Standing calls the precariat. The people who won't necessarily define themselves as working class, but are still going from paycheck to paycheck. I said the other day to someone, they're going from month to month, and she said, I'm going from prayer to prayer. They're just trying to get by. And actually, I think when we all come together, when the coalition of the working class, for precariat, small businesses who are vital to tackle the climate crisis, when we all come together to be that 99% and recognise our collective power, as long as the working class voices are central to that co-design, as long as they are put at the front and centre, so that marginalised voices and the voices who have traditionally been least listened to, who have done the least to cause the climate crisis, but are the most effective. That, for me, is the winning combination, how we can take on power and wealth in this country. Now, the first place I want to start is how there's no environmental justice without racial, social, and economic justice too. This is both when you look at international affairs, that our country is based on colonialism, on empire. We extracted that oil and gas from the global south. We continue to do so. And so when you see meetings at COP, the global event where countries come together each year, and they point the finger at other countries and say, you need to decarbonise, look at our example. They're totally forgetting how much we benefited from the Industrial Revolution, how we still absolutely have to decarbonise now and show the global leadership. But it is not us for a second to point at other countries and tell them what to do. It is about us getting our house in order, both for moral reasons, but yes, absolutely, to transform this country, to have cleaner air, to have greener jobs, to reduce people's bills, to make sure that the new jobs, the new industries we're creating are in trade unions, that are public sector jobs, that yes, have fair pay, but also decent working conditions, where we talk about what does a better life look like. For far too long, we were told we would work less hours and have more pay. I don't know about you, but that's not the experience of most people I know. In fact, it's the complete opposite. So what does a better life look like? What does a 4-day working week look like? We know we didn't achieve anything without the trade unions getting us a bank holiday, getting us lower working hours or smaller working hours. It's absolutely going to be about unions and, even more importantly, within those unions, the worker power, rather than the trade union leaders necessarily, but the worker power, the strength in numbers. That together, when we organise, along with campaign movements and, yes, political parties, that is how we can and will achieve change. It's the only thing that ever has, and I believe it's the only thing that ever will. When we talk about social justice, this is about recognising, I'm Deputy Leader of the Green Party. I can talk about the climate crisis all day, don't worry, I won't. But I'm always very happy to. But actually, I think the entry point that we always need to come to is if you're someone who is struggling to put food on the table, to heat your home, to have a job if you want a job, to get to work, then talk about the climate crisis can feel very distant. Now, I really want to caveat this because I sometimes hear people say, working class people don't care about the climate crisis. That's incredibly patronising to the amount of working class people who are at the front and centre of the climate justice struggle as well as the class struggle, because they know it's the same struggle. But what is also true is that if you are struggling just to get through the day-to-day, then tackling the climate crisis is not necessarily your first and central priority. We know that the climate crisis is exacerbating the inequality crisis. We also know that the climate crisis as I've said, will hit the poorest communities the most. But actually what we need to do is make sure we're working to reduce people's bills, to make sure that public transport is the cheapest form of public transport, that we are not looking at individual responsibility, we are looking at system change. And within here, I think, is the greatest trap for the green movement, for the environmental movement, for class struggle, which is the corporate media, which is owned by a couple of billionaires who are the same people who donate to the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. They're the same people when people like myself go on TV or other politicians say to me, are you vegan? Do you drive? Do you fly? Now, as it happens, I am vegan, I don't drive, and I don't fly. But that is not the point. I only do those things because I have the privilege to be able to do those things. I only do those things because I recognise when I have the privilege to do that, when I talk to the media, I'd rather talk about system change than be called a hypocrite. But we absolutely cannot allow the corporate media to allow this to become calling people out on individual change. This absolutely has to be about a mass government movement who publicly subsidises, who takes our water and our energy into national and public ownership to make sure that we're reducing bills, that we're creating those jobs. All of this is there for the taking. And we must not let this Labour government say for a second, echoing some sort of Thatcherite policy, that there is no money left. We know there is plenty of wealth in this country. Poor people for decades have been getting poorer, while the rich have been getting richer. And my friends, it is time to tax the rich. And finally, I just want to say, because we will get into this, that ultimately climate struggle is nothing without class struggle. We know, and we've seen over and over again, that while there are struggles to have around race, ethnicity, gender, disability, these are all important, but ultimately class is the underlying driver here. We know that when people are not given the material means to be able to get themselves out of inequality or get themselves out of poverty, then politicians like myself or campaign groups can say what they want. They will ultimately be trapped in everlasting cycles of poverty. However, I think we need to look to New York City, Zohran Mamdani. He's done this brilliantly. You can absolutely centre class struggle and still centre race struggle. You can still centre liberation for trans people. You can still centre disability. Ultimately, there is no environmental justice without racial, social and economic justice. And when they come for one of us, they come for all of us. And we must leave no one behind. Finally, I just want to say this. I'm deputy leader of a party. I'm running for leader of a party. But also I'm under no illusion that this is going to come from top-down politics. This is going to come from our communities. It's going to come from the workers, the churches, the mosques, the synagogues, the non-faith spaces. This is about communities like this coming together to not just imagine a better world, but to work for it, to campaign for it, and yes, to fight for it. And friends, that is how we'll change our towns, that's how we'll change our cities, and that is how we will change our country. Solidarity, and thank you.
Our next speaker, who I'd like to introduce, is Suzanne Jeffrey. She is a climate activist and a long-standing member of the Socialist Working Party.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, and it's good to see so many people here. Can you hear me? I didn't think so. So can we get some sound? There we go. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, all right, let's use this one. So it's good to see so many of you here, and thanks very much, Zack, for that excellent start to today's meeting. So we are 10 years since the Paris Agreement. This year is the anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And in that agreement, the goal of governments, through voluntary contributions to commit to reducing emissions, it has to be said, was to keep the world below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees of increased temperature rise, if that could be achievable. Then it was committed to it below 1.5 degrees. Now, we are not on track for that. In fact, we're in absolutely the opposite direction. And we've currently hit 1.5 degrees. The question now is that going to be sustained? There is a carbon budget to stay below 1.5 degrees, on which we're going to bust through in 2 or 3 years. And last year was the biggest rise in emissions. We're on a trajectory where emissions go up and up and up. And that is a failure of neoliberalism, it's a failure of social democracy over the last 10 years. And we are paying for that failure. We are paying for a failure of a system which hasn't prioritised tackling the climate crisis, hasn't prioritised working class people, and hasn't prioritised the planet that we live on either. And what has happened as a result of that crisis, continued crisis and continued failure, is no surprise as the world goes deeper and deeper into crisis, and we see the rise of the far right, of fascism, then those people who want to maintain that system as it crumbles and crumbles apart have looked for ways to weaponise the climate crisis. And that is what is happening at this minute in time. When you look at those people who want to sustain this system, then they are using the climate crisis as a further wedge in terms of the working class. Just as they have done in terms of migration, just as they have done in terms of race, just as they have done in terms of equalities and trans, it's a weaponised wedge to divide the working class between itself and against itself in order to sustain their system of profit, their system of climate crisis. That's what Trump's done with his drill baby drill. That's what he's done in terms of his election campaigning. That's what Farage is doing at this minute in time. And make no mistake about it, what Trump has done, and by his success, he's given fillip to the far right globally. What he is doing is trying to rehabilitate the fossil fuel industry. He's in hop to the billionaires in the oil and gas industry in terms of his election result, and he is trying to rehabilitate that fossil fuel industry. In some ways, we should take it as a credit that they were worried about the level of resistance and action to the extent that they have to marshal a set of arguments against the growing feeling that there was a climate crisis that was impacting on working class people. But it's not good enough, when you see the scale of what they're attempting to do. There are trillions of tons of carbon below the surface of this, when I say trillions and billions of tons, but trillions in terms of money as well. And that's what they want to do. They want to break the climate movement, they want to divide the working class in order to be benefiting from those trillions of dollars that are still under the ground. So Trump reframes it. The climate emergency becomes an energy emergency. It is drill baby drill. It's defined as liquid gold. It's defined as the future for good, well-paid jobs through fossil fuels industries, etc. And that's what Farage is doing in this country. Now, Starmer echoes that, unfortunately. Like he has done with so many other of the policies, he echoes this. And all we see from Starmer is retreat after retreat from any commitments that were made before the government was in power. And equally, we see a kind of use of that repressive legislation to weaken the climate movement. So we saw it first with climate activists. There are 16 climate activists in prison as we speak, with 41 years prison sentences between them. For simply joining a Zoom call to talk about peaceful direct action, to highlight the significance of the climate crisis. And now we've seen the disgrace of this government prescribing Palestine action for exactly the same kind of desire to challenge the system, to stand up for those people when they are being bombed, when they are being targeted, when they are being repressed. And this is the knee-jerk response of Starmer's government to oppress those people who fight for change in a better kind of society. We have to stand alongside the climate activists in prison. We have to stand alongside the activists in Palestine action. So the climate crisis is a working class issue, and ironically, if you put that question into Google, is the climate crisis a working class issue? Ironically, if you put that into Google, you get an AI-generated response using huge amounts of energy that tells you increasingly, yes, the climate crisis is seen as a working class issue, and then very helpfully goes through the list of things of the reasons why it's a working class issue. The disruptions in terms of people's lives and livelihoods, the inability to be able to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis, the forced migration, the inability to be able to afford, for example, insurance to cover the costs of the impacts of climate crisis, the impact on workplaces, the failure of public services that cannot sustain the impacts of the climate crisis. Thank you very much, AI. And funnily enough, the AI even finishes up with increasingly working class solidarity and organisation is seen as an important contributor to tackling the climate crisis. I could not agree more. But we have to, there's two things to say really. We know there are debates and arguments within the trade union movement. There is not a united position in terms of the climate crisis. There are some unions, for example, without denying the climate crisis, constantly position jobs versus the environment and suggest that we do need to continue to extract more oil and gas. And even those unions like my own that take some excellent positions, I'm in the NEU, we have to do more in terms of what that means, what that strategy means, what it looks like on the ground. I'm going to give you this quote. I think I'm going to try and give you this quote about capitalism. Where is it? Yes. Capitalism isn't a roadblock for mitigation. This misrepresents its relationship to the climate changes. No, capitalism is not the roadblock, capitalism is the generator. And I think that's absolutely right. A shorter way of saying it is system change, not climate change. But we cannot just be dealing in slogans and strategies. Last week, for example, there was extreme weather that we experienced in our workplaces. We have to have a working class movement that can respond to those impacts of the climate crisis, that can organise in the workplaces, that can stand up to management that want you to work in ridiculous temperatures, and a working class movement that also knows that if we're going to tackle the climate crisis, then we have to have a strategy that says our emissions need to be reduced, we need a different kind of society, we need a society based on the interests of working class people on the planet and not on those in power. I want to just finish on one thing, which is to say there's a bunch of us activists within the climate and the trade union movement who've campaigned long to shift the debate within the trade union movement. We have called in our own unions and have passed at national policy and hopefully passed also at the coming TUC. We know that passing policies is nothing if activists don't take this up in their own trade unions and in their own workplaces and part of the organisations, the left organisations, the Green Party that they are part of. And we have called for a year of trade union climate action within the trade union movement, in solidarity with others, alongside other climate organisations. We will kickstart that year of action at the time of the COP talks in Brazil this year. How ironic is that those talks will be held in the Amazon rainforest, where they will fail yet again to put forward the kind of actions that we need to tackle the climate crisis. But in our workplaces, on the 14th of November, get the date in your diary, please. All of us here can turn the sloganising of the system change, not climate change. We can turn the sloganising of capitalism as the generator into meaningful working class action on the 14th of November and forward from that point. We have to shift the debate in the trade union movement. We have to make sure that the working class is centre and forefront of this very utterly urgent and systemic fight that we need to win. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Now I'd like to introduce our final speaker, who is Asad Rehman, who is also a long-standing climate justice activist and has been important with linking racism and climate change together.
Thank you, colleagues. Can you hear me? Or do I have to? Thank you, comrades, and great to see so many friends over many decades who've been involved in really trying to reframe climate. And I think we should first accept that, we are in a moment where we are losing, and we are losing absolutely badly. And there are a whole number of reasons why we're losing. And there is one that has to be put at the feet of the environment and the climate movement, which was to deliberately depoliticize a deeply political issue. Climate has always been about class. Climate has always been about racial justice and gender justice. And climate has always been about internationalism. And people turn climate into an issue about personal responsibility, about plastic straws and plastic bags, when we know that this is deeply structural. And I want to first pay testament to the movements Because this conversation is not something that's just happened in the last few years. I think, this year more than any other year, when we mark, in 1955, just in April of 1955, the 29 of the newly liberated countries in Asia and Africa came together in the Bandung Conference, talking about what would a decolonized world look like, talked about agrarian reform, talked about how to rebuild societies and economies that put the environment and people's interests at the same place, talked about how you build public services, how you stop the hundreds of years of extraction and exploitation. And in 1966, when countries from Latin America and Asia and Africa got together, the Tricontinental Conference in Cuba, and talked about rebuilding a new global economy, talked about how do you decolonize the global economy. These were the basis on understanding the relationship between people's economies and societies and the environment. The argument that just transition was founded in recent times, no. Movements, our anti-imperialist movements, of course, have always argued for a just, equitable and ecological transition. And we know that many of them, whether it was Mossadegh in Iran, Albenzi in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, Lumumba in Congo, were massacred and were overthrown and assassinated because they threatened the economic interests of the global north. We know that many of our anti-imperialist movements over the 70s and 80s were destroyed. But we are in a moment again, a moment when we think back. Some of us, when we marched during the World Economic Forum against the G8 and the G7 at the time, we met in Brazil, if you remember, back in 2001 in the World Social Forum. And the slogan of that forum, of course, was, another world is possible. And I would say, whilst we did a lot in terms of analysing the crisis at the time, we failed in the real big question, which was how do we create a narrative and a story that connects our movements, and how do we build power? And absolutely, as Zack said, a fundamental key question for us now is how do we build power? And I want to just remind again that this conversation about, is climate a class issue? People in the global north maybe have stumbled onto this more recently, but people in the global south and our movements in the global south have always understood that climate and environment was a class issue. Chico Mendes, a legendary Brazilian trade unionist environmentalist, very famously said, ecology without class consciousness is merely gardening. And that has always been true. And that's why at this moment, when we are facing, as Suzanne said, we're in a life and death situation. The carbon budget for 1.5 is going to be gone in 3 to 5 years. This is when we already say the very economic and the very systems that we all rely on to live, breathe, everything begin to unravel. We'll lose 2 degrees within the next decade or 2 decades. We're currently heading towards 2.7 to at least 3 degrees warming by the end of the century. And we're not reducing our emissions. In fact, as you heard, the global north, particularly the richest countries in the world, are increasing their fossil fuel extraction. 55% of the global increase in fossil fuel extraction, the United States, United Kingdom, the European Union, and Australia. So richest countries in the world. And we know that fundamentally there is a challenge for our movement. And it was posed to us by the Gilets jaunes. Remember the yellow vest, right? When they said, quite rightly, they said the elites, you worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month. And unless we as a movement begin to understand how do we connect the fight against climate to the fight against economic inequality, we will lose. We know this. We know how the right are weaponizing poverty against climate. And there is actually a solution, because incredibly, the solution to the crisis of inequality, the crisis of climate, the crisis of our ecosystems collapses, and even our crisis of our economic system, our rigged economic system which benefits the elites and the billionaires, are all exactly the same. And you don't have to be a Marxist or a revolutionary or a socialist to even say that. You only needed to look at the IPCC, the world's climate scientists, in their report that they publish every 5 years. They said the solutions to now, you need a compact on poverty and climate if we're going to tackle the climate crisis. And they said, what do you need for that? They said, well, you need universal public services. You need to make food and energy a public good that people have a right to and is not being exploited. You need to talk about the right to housing. You need to ensure that people have living wages. There is the basis of us beginning to build a program of activity, A program of demands that connects the climate crisis to the crisis of cost of living and economic crisis. And we have made huge movements and changes to the climate movement. From the moment of the climate movement, when I first joined over many decades ago, when it was largely a white middle class movement in the global north that talked about reducing carbon, where we wanted to talk about reducing injustice, to a movement now that is standing side by side with the Palestinians and saying we know that there can be no climate justice without justice for the Palestinian people. Because as President Petro said from Colombia, he said, in the faces of the Palestinian people, we in the global south, black, brown, indigenous people, we not only see our past, we see our present, and we see the future, because that is the future of their economic system. Their lack of action is to sacrifice the global south, is to sacrifice the poorest. I was just a couple of months ago in Sri Lanka with trade unionists and movements from across South Asia. People talking on the factory floors of 50-degree temperatures. In Pakistan, the government digging mass graves because temperatures are 53 degrees, where workers don't have a choice to be able to sit in air-conditioned buildings. They're actually out there because they know unless they're working, they won't be able to put food to feed their families. We know that the cost of living crisis and the cost of green crisis, that the 99% of the world that in the last year that owned, for every dollar that we earn, the millionaires made 2.3 million. For the billionaires, they added 2 billion a day to their wealth. So not only do we have to talk about we need wealth taxes, we need to ask ourselves, why do billionaires exist? If we can have a minimum wage, we should have a maximum wage. We should actually be We now know that this global economic system that has been predicated on illegal tax and threat and trade, that is just as colonial as and when they have the military gunships in our countries, the same logic of exploitation and extraction. Our only hope is to challenge those. And I have to say to the labour movement, as an active trade unionist myself, you know, on our banners in our trade union movement, we don't have the words British workers unite. We have the words workers of the world unite. And we have to say to the trade union movement, this isn't a question of, this isn't a question of, you know, British jobs versus jobs for and livelihoods of workers in the global south. This is a moment for us to rebuild solidarity and internationalism. And when we think back to our trade union movement, and just down the road here, when the Maxwell strike took place and when the unions were formed here in East London, people didn't talk about simply talking about jobs and livelihoods. They talked about the right to live with dignity. They talked about solidarity and internationalism. And this is the area where workers took part in a sugar boycott of Toyota Line, where workers stood up against fascism and went to Spain to fight for democracy when our government was silent against the rise of fascism. Workers here have always understood solidarity is the most important and most powerful word and action that we have. But we have to rebuild that power. And the way to rebuild that power is not to talk about it's either, but it's an and. If we're going to fight for an NHS in this country, we should be fighting for a global NHS. And every time we fight for a living wage here, we should be talking about a living wage in the global south as well. We have to stop the fight between workers in the global north, only seeing that this is about redistribution of more and more, a smaller and smaller amount of wealth of the global north against the livelihoods of the people in the global south. There is hope, and I just want to maybe just say at the end, this year is a critical moment. We are going to be in Brazil for the COP. It's the first time for many years that our social movements from all around the world are connecting and collecting and organising together. And organising together not only about a narrative of just and equitable and ecological transition, but also talking about how we build our power. How do we build target, first on tax and debt and trade, which we've been doing, but now in September, on September 20th, to mobilise and bring the cost of living and austerity crisis movements and anti-poverty movements together with the climate movement. And taking to the streets and showing our power. And then, of course, during Brazil, we have to make sure that our government, the UK government, isn't going to Brazil and selling out not only workers and working people in this country, but also taking part in selling out workers and workers around the world. This is a huge fight. It's not going to be won in 1 year, but this is the fight of our lifetime. And this is the only way we fight and win this is if we have a framework of eco-socialism, internationalism and solidarity. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you so much, Asad. Now I'm going to invite everyone to chat to the people next to you for around 3 announcements before I bring back in our speakers for 3 minutes each. As you know, today is sadly the final day of Marxism. Don't miss the closing rally at 5:30 p.m. with speakers including Ramses Filani, William Bennett and Sophia Beach. And please join us at the after party at the Red Lion pub in Hoxton, 7-minute walk. Secondly, there is a national counter-demonstration against fascist Tommy Robinson and the far right on the 13th of September. Everyone here should be there. It's called by anti-racism. You can pick up posters in the Marx room. And lastly, we've been joined the whole festival by the lovely Bookmarks Bookshop. They're Britain's biggest and best socialist bookshop, so please make sure you go and buy these books here at the front. And our author also spoke at this meeting. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Zack for 3 minutes, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting discussion, and thanks for all the contributions. I guess I want to start with the very obvious place, which is I'm not here to defend the Australian Greens, the Norwegian Greens, the German Greens, but what I would reflect particularly in Germany is that the Linke, someone who aligns much more with my politics, also don't call a genocide a genocide. And that's because of historic, cultural issues within Germany. But what I would say to the German Greens, and indeed to the Linke, is I don't call a genocide in spite of being a Jewish person. I call it a genocide because I'm a Jewish person. And when we say... When we say in my family history, never again, that was never again, not for one person, one group of people, but for everybody, never again. I don't want to get sidetracked too much with the pro-peace movement, other than to say, of course, the military-industrial complex is also a huge issue in here. Of course, that is also furthering the climate crisis. Of course, it is working-class people when we see Keir Starmer jingoistic, ready for war, that will be sent to go fight in those wars. And of course, we absolutely must say in this country that we stand for peace, we stand for planet, and we stand to say no more profit from war. Finally, there is so much I want to say in response to what people were saying around the class issue, but I know Suzanne and Asad are about to nail it, so I'm going to go with something much more practical for 30 seconds. I'm elected in London, and just last Thursday I went to Epsom Hospital, where I met 300 striking workers. They are Nepalese, Indian, all migrant workers. We went into the NHS board meeting. The board would not listen to the workers. I went in there, the board listened to me. Again, this is an issue with how the NHS Trust would listen to an elected politician, but they would not listen to the workers. The very workers who are cleaning that hospital, who are providing the catering in that hospital, who are the porters in that hospital. I have managed to get them to agree to a meeting with the workers and with their unions. This has not gone far enough yet, though. The union is the United Voices of the World. They're a migrant union. I would say to everyone in this room, please go to uvw.org.uk. Please write a letter to that board. Let them know that this is not acceptable. 2, if you can and you are able to, please donate to the strike fund. Ultimately, this conversation, I think, has had the same thread running through it. That ultimately, this is all our struggle. I think Asad and my Mancunian, I'm also from Manchester, friend in the front row, put this brilliantly, that again, this is not a new thing. This has been going on for generations, and it has always been working class people in this country who have been exploited to further exploit people around the world. And ultimately, we need to recognise that. Stand not just with working class people, it's not us and them, we are one us. We all need to stand together and make sure that the voices who are most affected by the climate crisis are centred in this conversation and leading this conversation. Once again, thank you very much for the session and solidarity.
Thank you so much, Zack. Suzanne Jeffrey.
Yeah, thanks as ever to everybody who spoke, and it was great to have some contributions from our international comrades. That was really helpful to hear what's happening and how comrades are responding to it internationally. So we are in a climate crisis. It is real, it is a lived reality, and it is set to get worse. there ain't going to be any tipping points. There are tipping points in terms of the speed of the climate crisis. There isn't going to be tipping points in terms of, a comrade at the front spoke about, I'm not saying you were suggesting that, Martin, but these extreme weather events don't tip over necessarily into more urgent action. In fact, what is happening at this minute in time is those extreme weather events are being exploited and they are being blamed on other forces, whether that's Democrat politicians in the US or whether that's migrants supposedly setting fires in Greece. They are used to re-divide and reiterate the divisions that are already existing in society. We have to be absolutely clear about the danger of the far right. And our friend that there spoke about the Lincoln mayor. Absolutely right to speak about that. One thing I would say differently is I don't think it's simply ideological. I think if they can get away with this, they will push full fracking in this country. Any reform-led government, God forbid, would be pushing that agenda. And that was a great tribute to the climate movement in this country that we resisted. It isn't the case in the US, where there was a fracking revolution, and currently Trump's energy minister is a fracking magnet, Chris Wright, who's pushing ahead with all of these terrible policies that Trump is pushing forward. So it's a real challenge to us, and we have to therefore organise in the way that we say in terms of working class communities. Just a comrade spoke about the climate movement and mentioned greenwashing. I'm glad because, and so did our friend from Australia, and we haven't mentioned that in this conversation, but it's a really important part of the discussion about the greenwashing that goes on. And so it's either, let's have more oil and gas, or we'll greenwash the oil and gas. Basically, they're the two models that are going on at this minute time. But just in terms of the climate movement, see, because I want to address myself to the left at the end of this conversation. The climate movement that you described, that is sort of bought into sort of accepting the market system or whatever, is one wing of the climate movement. There is another wing of the climate movement that many of us have been trying to embed ourselves and organise in for quite some years, that have shifted the debate, as I'll probably speak about this, away from the question of polar bears and the question of climate justice. And now that movement is able to take to the streets and stand alongside Palestinian actors. But we have to take another step forward. And that wing of the movement both has to continue to challenge, but it also, the wing of the movement says the market's going to work. Of course, I'm not sure anyone thinks that anymore. But has to take a further step forward, which is about the assertion of class. It is a class issue. It's an issue of international solidarity. And it is about how do we organise within the working class and within the left. And someone mentioned a new left party. If there is a new left party, it would be absolutely central from the outset that climate is a key fighting ground for that new left party. It's not always guaranteed. I mean, that's the reality of it. So we do have to fight for that, the left. So the final thing I want to say is this. Comrade mentioned capitalism. Look, pretty much most of us here are going to be in agreement. Capitalism is the problem. We need to end capitalism. But we have to have a strategy. We can't simply deal in slogans and say that capitalism is terrible, down with capitalism. We have to have a strategy. We have to make that an actual... We'd have a strategy for fighting racism. We'd always have a strategy for fighting... We wouldn't just say racism is a terrible thing, it's rooted in capitalism. We'd have a strategy. We have to talk about that strategy now. And part of that strategy, small though it may seem, is that we have to remobilise the climate movement and the working class element within the climate movement. We have an opportunity this year in terms of the dates that were mentioned. 20th September, Asad may speak more about that. I will mention the 14th of November again, a workplace day of trade union action on climate. What are you going to do? What motion are you going to pass? If we can't win a maximum temperature in workplaces, we will not bring working class people with us in terms of challenging this climate crisis. And some of the things become as basic as that. And the 15th of November, let's take to the streets on the 15th of November as part of an international movement of global solidarity demanding the changes that we need, and then take that back into our workplaces, into our unions, etc. And we have to organise. We have to have a strategy. We know that the problem is capitalism. How do we defeat capitalism? We need a strategy within the working class movement to do that. And it is urgent.
So just picking up on Suzanne talked about in terms of strategy. Look, there was a time when there was large part of the environment and the climate movement thought that the answer to the climate crisis was simply to say, we must act. Just make the call, and that governments would act rationally, and somehow there would be, the right people would do the right things. And for the last 30 years, we've seen the reality of that, right? Which is not, it has not worked. Now, we have shifted collectively the climate movement massively, right? From when it was talking about bloody polar bears to now understanding what climate is. That fundamentally climate is an expression of our rigged global economy, and it's a question of power. And that does require us to have a strategy. And it's no good, I'm sorry, it's no good for people to simply say, well, the answer is revolution, right? Actually, if that was the answer, we'd be in a very, very different place as a movement, right? You have to think about how do we connect our movements. And for many of us, we've been talking now for years, how do we build a movement of movement? A movement of movements isn't just an abstract goal. It's about understanding where our communities are and weaving those stories together and weaving those demands together and bringing the labour movement with us, like we brought the anti-race agreement with, about the climate movement turning up at the Parliament of Palestine and connecting our movements and connecting our fights and stuff and being able to have a framework. Look, we all know, now increasingly, even mainstream environment movements, you know, not just like the more progressive and radical ones, but even mainstream ones, will all say, we know that the clock is ticking, that it's not possible to reform and allow the market to actually try and resolve this. If it was, we would have done it 30 years ago. Of course it's not. Now you need a strong state, you need a planning, you need intervention. These are all the things that progressives and social progressives have always called for. So now we have to do that. And I do think there are questions for us, real deep questions that the climate movements can't simply say no to fossil fuels. Because the majority of people don't connect to that. We actually have to take this fight to making energy a right. So it connects with people who can't afford to pay their bills, who don't live in warm homes, who recognise that the reality of their struggle is about actually affording energy, not a question of what kind of energy. And if we don't understand that, we're not going to win. We have to connect and move away from simply talking about climate as being something about fossil fuels and actually connect it to the fight around food as well. Because that at least connects with where people are on a day-to-day level, that people can't afford to pay for food. Yet we know we can feed the world 3 times over, and yet a third of all the food that we produce is destroyed at its end. Why? Because the largest corporations in the world control our food systems. Less than 20% of all the land in the world feeds about 80% of the world. The rest, of course, is industrial agribusiness. So it's absolutely right, we have to think about what are the demands that begin to connect those fights, make the fight for seeds, make the fight in terms of taking on industrial agribusiness and the industrial fossil fuel system, and connect them to the fight around people's material needs, which are about public services, social protection, living wages. And that does require us to move, not only in terms of talking about what they need. We need public ownership. You cannot transition the energy system without public ownership, not just in terms of distribution and generation, but also in extraction. It has to be planned. You need public ownership of our food systems. These are now really, really critical things. So I'm going to just end by just saying one thing. Look, it's not just the climate crisis we're facing. We've reached 6 out of 9 planetary limits. We face a global crisis of inequality. And if we don't have an answer, the right do have an answer. Their right isn't simply just saying ignore climate change. Actually, the real right is saying climate crisis tells us why we need walls and fences, why we need a militarized response, why we have to say that, as Joseph Borrell, the former EU foreign minister, said, Europe is a garden, outside of the garden is the jungle is trying to come into the garden, our role is to go out into the jungle and prevent that. That's the reality. This is not just the far right. This is actually mainstream politicians are now saying that the crisis is happening, and the only answer to that is racism, securitization, and militarization. We have to have an answer and a solution, and that requires a strategy plan. One of the first things we've got to do is show and connect our power. That's why on the 20th of September we are calling for a movement of movements to come out on the street, to connect the fight against austerity and cost of living in this crisis, in this country, to the fight for climate justice. And then, of course, as Suzanne said, there will be a global mobilization on November 15th, and we have to do part possible.